Hello and welcome to the Audio Stories. Today I will tell you about one of the most dramatic space missions in history, about Apollo 13, which was supposed to be a routine trip to the moon, but turned into a fight for survival. If you like what I do, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel, leave a like and comment, and this will certainly help develop audio stories. On April 11, 1970, at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, a powerful Saturn V rocket lit up the sky over Cape Kennedy, Florida. This was the beginning of the Apollo 13 mission, the third manned expedition to the lunar surface. To outside observers, it looked like a routine operation. After all, Americans have already landed on the moon twice. The first time was in July 1969, when Neil Armstrong took his historic step onto the surface of the silver globe, and again a few months later, when Apollo 12's Alan Bean and Pete Conrad conducted more advanced scientific research. Apollo 13 was intended to be the next step in lunar exploration. The destination was the Fra Mauro Plateau, a geologically fascinating region where astronauts would collect samples of material ejected during the formation of the Sea of Rains, one of the largest impact craters in the solar system. The mission commander was James Lovell, a veteran of the space program who had previously participated in the Gemini 7, Gemini 12, and Apollo 8 missions. This was his fourth spaceflight, which was a record at the time. The command module pilot was Jack Swigert, while the lunar module pilot was Fred Hayes. It is worth mentioning that Swigert was not originally supposed to participate in this mission. Just 3 days before launch, he replaced Ken Mattingly, who was removed from the mission after potentially being exposed to measles. It was a controversial move, but necessary for the safety of the entire crew. Mattingly never fell ill, which only adds irony to the events that were soon to unfold. The launch of Apollo 13 was almost perfect. The only disturbing incident was the premature shutdown of the central engine in the second stage of the Saturn V rocket. The remaining engines ran longer to compensate for the problem, and the spacecraft achieved its planned orbit. At the time, no one knew that this was the first warning sign in a mission that would soon become a fight for survival. The first 2 days of the journey passed peacefully. The astronauts performed routine activities, conducted minor experiments, and prepared for the moon landing. They also broadcast live images from the spacecraft, showing their everyday life in space. Unfortunately, due to the abundance of other events, television stations did not broadcast this material. It may sound strange, but lunar missions had already become commonplace for the media, and public opinion was preoccupied with more mundane matters, such as the war in Vietnam or economic problems. This indifference turned into keen interest when news came from space that the crew's lives were in danger. On April 13, 1970, almost exactly 56 hours after launch, words that made history were spoken from the deck of Apollo 13. Contrary to popular belief perpetuated by the Tom Hanks movie, Jack Swigert did not say, "Houston, we have a problem." His actual words were, "Okay, Houston, we have had a problem here." However, when Gene Kranz, the flight director at Mission Control, asked for a repeat, James Lovell replied with the famous phrase, "Houston, we have had a problem." This slight difference, the use of the past tense instead of the present, may seem insignificant, but it captures the crew's initial uncertainty about the nature of the problem. At first, the astronauts didn't know exactly what had happened. They heard a loud bang and noticed a drop in voltage in the electrical system. Initially, they thought about a micrometeoroid impact. However, the truth turned out to be much more serious. An explosion occurred in the number 2 liquid oxygen tank in the service module. The cause was a series of unfortunate events and errors that began on Earth. This tank had been dropped during maintenance 2 years earlier and then installed in the Apollo 13 service module. It also included a thermostat rated for 28 volts, while the spacecraft's electrical system provided 65 volts. During pre-launch testing, when the tank failed to empty normally, engineers used a heater to remove oxygen. However, the high temperature damaged the insulation of the electrical wires inside the tank. When Swigert turned on the equipment before a scheduled television broadcast, a short circuit occurred, igniting the insulation. The explosion ruptured tank number 2 and damaged the adjacent tank number 1. As a result, all the oxygen needed to power the fuel cells that produced electricity, water, and heat began to escape into space. Gene Kranz, the flight director, immediately gathered his engineers to assess the situation. What they saw was terrifying. The life support systems in the Odyssey command module were dying. The fuel cells shut down one by one due to lack of oxygen. The Aquarius lunar module, intended only for landing on the moon, now had to become a lifeboat for 3 astronauts. NASA engineers faced problems that no one had previously predicted. The lunar module was designed to support 2 people for 36 hours, and now it had to keep 3 astronauts alive for more than 4 days. It was necessary to drastically reduce the consumption of energy, water, and oxygen. The temperature inside dropped to about 3 degrees Celsius. The astronauts suffered from cold, dehydration, and fatigue. They also had to improvise a carbon dioxide removal system when the lunar module's lithium hydroxide absorbers ran out. One of the most fascinating moments of this mission was the creation of a makeshift adapter for carbon dioxide absorbers. The Aquarius lunar module used cylindrical absorbers, while the Odyssey command module used square ones. The engineers in Houston had to come up with a way to connect the square insert to the round hole. Using only items available on board, socks, plastic document covers, duct tape, and flight plan pages, they created an adapter that was later called a textbook example of engineering improvisation. The next challenge was changing the flight trajectory. Apollo 13 was on course for the moon, but under the circumstances, the only solution was to return to Earth as quickly as possible. The lunar module engine was used for this purpose. The first maneuver was performed 2 hours after the failure. It put the spacecraft on a flight path around the moon, which allowed it to use lunar gravity to accelerate its return to Earth. Then, as they orbited the moon, the astronauts found themselves on the so-called dark side, 40 kilometers from the surface. The view was spectacular, but the crew had little time to admire the landscape. Every minute was spent conserving resources and preparing for the return. Another correction maneuver was performed using the lunar module engine, which was extremely difficult due to the different maneuvering characteristics of the connected spacecraft. Aquarius was not designed to propel the entire Apollo complex. In addition, the lack of a stable power supply meant that navigation computers frequently shut down. The astronauts had to manually keep the ship's orientation using the stars as reference points, which was extremely difficult with the windows fogged up. As Apollo 13 approached Earth, the crew had to return to the Odyssey command module, which was the only one with the heat shield necessary to survive re-entry. This meant that systems that had been powered down for almost 4 days had to be restarted. No one knew whether the severely chilled spacecraft would turn on at all. John Aaron, one of the flight controllers, developed a procedure for starting the systems with minimal energy consumption. This procedure was so unusual that it had to be sent on board and carefully checked before being used. Fortunately, Odyssey's systems came to life. The astronauts detached the service module and saw the full extent of the destruction for the first time. The entire sidewall of the module was torn off by the explosion, making them realize how close they had come to death. The Aquarius lunar module, which had served them faithfully for 4 days, was then discarded. Under normal circumstances, this would be a routine procedure, but this time it had an emotional dimension. As Lovell later recalled, Aquarius had saved their lives, and abandoning it was like saying goodbye to a good friend. Now it all depended on the Odyssey heat shield. If it had been damaged in the explosion, the astronauts would burn up on entry into the atmosphere. There was also the expected loss of communication, which is typical when returning from space, caused by the ionization of the air around the spacecraft. Under normal circumstances, this would take about 3 minutes. This time, the silence was prolonged, increasing the tension in mission control. On April 17th, at 1:07 p.m. Eastern Time, the Odyssey command module splashed down in the Pacific. After a communications blackout 4 minutes longer than usual, the Apollo 13 crew made contact with a rescue helicopter from the USS Iwo Jima. They were safe, The Apollo 13 mission officially ended in failure. It did not achieve its main goal, which was to land on the moon. Paradoxically, however, it became one of NASA's greatest triumphs, an example of how teamwork, improvisation, and composure can save lives in the most extreme conditions. After returning to Earth, the astronauts were recovering from the grueling experience. Fred Hayes, who struggled with a urinary tract infection and fever during the mission, required longer hospitalization. Jack Swigert never went into space again. He resigned from NASA in 1973 to pursue a political career. James Lovell, despite being one of NASA's most experienced astronauts, also did not return to space. However, the story of Apollo 13 did not end with the safe return of the astronauts. In its wake, NASA conducted a thorough review of safety procedures and spacecraft designs. A third oxygen tank was added, placed a safe distance from the other two. They also redesigned the electrical system to prevent similar failures in the future. Engineers began to pay more attention to seemingly minor incidents and inconsistencies in equipment. The story of an oxygen tank drop 2 years earlier, which ultimately caused the failure, became a warning against downplaying even the smallest deviations from the norm. Thanks to the lessons learned from this mission, subsequent trips to the moon occurred without major incidents. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. If you like this story, be sure to press the subscribe button and give a thumbs up, and leave a comment. I'm very curious about what you think about this mission. Do you consider it a failure, or maybe one of NASA's greatest successes? I also encourage you to listen to other materials on this channel. The full list of episodes can be found in the Videos tab. Please let me know what other topics you would like to hear about.